Hello, Susanna Lobez here, actor turned barrister turned broadcaster turned true crime writer, and proud member of Sisters in Crime Australia. Welcome to the Scarlet Stiletto Bites podcast. For over 30 years now, Sisters in Crime Australia has supported our women crime writers, both true crime and fiction, and some criminal literary talent has been unearthed. Among many awards, there's an annual prize for short crime fiction, the Scarlet Stiletto Awards. And for those of you who prefer your stories by ear, in 2023 we commenced this podcast series, Scarlet Stiletto Bites, to celebrate the Sisters' 30th anniversary. Each story is short, but not always sweet. Expect twisted tales, quirky humour, and a frisson of feminism. Please support us by following, sharing, reviewing, and generally spreading the word. We have no paywall. Today's story is about a man so revoltingly sexist, he could single-handedly have launched a major feminist tsunami. A Man of Fashion by Lesley Truffle, a Scarlet Stiletto winner, 2010. It started with a white Panama hat. The Panama travelled out on a P&O liner, the Iberia, in 1962. First class, of course, all the way from London to Melbourne. The hat was in good company, as all Jude's clothes were premium quality. Actually, they were better than that, for they were bespoke tailored and had been created without the use of a pre-existing pattern. The cabin steward, Johnny, was impressed by Jude's evening wear, several tuxedos, morning coats, and not just one but two white sharkskin jackets. If clothes really do maketh the man, then Jude had been manufactured in heaven. As Johnny explained to a fellow galley slave, "The bastard's got morning suits, day suits, evening suits, and creeping around in the bloody middle of the night suits, and everything tagged with his name in embroidery, Jude D. Worthington." "What's the D stand for?" "Dick. He's got a quilted satin dressing gown with his initials on the breast pocket, in case he's so hungover he can't remember who the hell he is. He even leaves his silk underpants with their name on them, in case he leaves them somewhere he shouldn't." "Well, why would he bother getting his undies handmade?" "Dunno. Perhaps the bastard has to. He's hung like a donkey." "What's the missus like?" Sex kitten. You should see her evening dresses. They're a real bugger to press. Silks, satins, taffeta, and you should see the quality of the velvets. Tight all over, breasts everywhere. She's real classy. Nothing slutty about her. When she gets dolled up and goes to the dining room, the officers drool in their soup. Eats at the captain's table all the time. He's crazy for her. Looks like Sophia Loren, with better teeth. Yeah, but I bet she's pretty ordinary without the expensive clobber." "No, mate. When she gets up in the morning, no makeup, no nothing. She's edible, like she's been unwrapped from tissue paper. No morning breath. Smells good like roses." Jude had always had the best, so naturally his wife Eve was top shelf. He'd made sure of it. Not only was she beautiful and of good genetic stock, but she had a master's in chemistry. At university she'd written a brilliant dissertation on chemical warfare, and the dean had stated it's so incisive and seminal that it could well have been written by a man. High praise indeed. But it just wasn't done for a gentleman of Jude's class to have a working wife. Eve was his domestic goddess and would create his family. He'd get Technicolor cards printed of the children around the Christmas tree, a perfect Kodak moment. Jude knew damn well that clothes entered the conversation before he did. so he ensured that before he opened his mouth he'd be well received. The Panama hat was good at entering the conversation first, and it drew attention to his best features. Not that he had any ugly features. As his mother told everybody, "My only child does me proud. Blonde, blue-eyed, tall and agreeable. All the girls want him. When Jude was born, the mould broke." He'd broken more than just a few moulds. Hearts had been broken randomly and carelessly all over England, not to mention a few vacation spots in warmer climes. Funnily enough, most men didn't warm to him. It was hinted he was flaky and untrustworthy, but Jude didn't have to worry about where his next lay was coming from. It was whispered that at least 2 girls had been forced to leave university because he'd made them pregnant. The university authorities had it down pat. The slut would be soundly punished, and the boy whom she'd shamelessly misled would stay on to finish his degree. At Waterloo Station, Jude's pregnant girlfriend sobbed, "You've got charm, looks and buckets of money, and what have I got? A baby I don't want and no husband. How could you do this to me?" How indeed? After she'd stopped hitting him, he'd stroked her hair and stuffed a wad of folding readies into her handbag. She'd refused to take the money initially, but what good were principles when you were going home in disgrace to live with your parents in a crummy half-house in Essex? Jude loathed gloomy girls and couldn't wait to see the back of her. Besides, another girlfriend was whining that she hadn't had a period for 4 months. It was getting expensive. Perhaps he should start wearing prophylactics. Bloody awful things. Might just as well take a shower in a raincoat. On the ship, the Panama hat charmed quite a few ladies of easy virtue, but Jude wanted to start his marriage off right. Well, actually, that's a lie. Some of his future colleagues were on board, and when one of them murmured, "We've noticed you've been spending a bit of time with the girls downstairs," Jude realised he'd have to clean up his act. Everyone knew Jude was a first-rate chemical engineer with expertise in explosives, and that the Australian government was welcoming him with open arms. Unfortunately, Jude's career aspirations limited his sex life, and he was reduced to shagging shopgirls from tourist class, usually in the lifeboats. It wasn't optimal. Things didn't look too rosy when the Worthingtons disembarked at Melbourne. They were staying in a fifth-rate hotel in Kensington before moving to their government-built home. It was stinking hot, and Jude had removed the Panama hat. He didn't want it sweat-stained. Eve stared out the taxi window. She couldn't believe their hotel was in such close proximity to the stockyards and abattoir. Cattle were being driven down the street. There were ugly metal railings protecting the footpaths and front gardens. How barbaric. She hadn't known Australians lived like this. The stench of death and animal fear was overpowering. For weeks she'd been cosseted in deep luxury, and now she had to rough it. What would Mother say if she could see her now? As the Worthingtons climbed the hotel steps, they heard a ruckus behind them. There were dirty men with shotguns, swearing at a bull that had broken free of the pack. The bull was right behind Eve, his hooves clattering and slipping on the steps. Eve screamed and flung herself at the doors, but they'd been locked by the manager. She could see his terrified face on the other side of the glass. Jude backed up against the handrail and remained very still. Eve was flailing around, attracting the bull's attention. Jude hoped the beast would gore her first. He examined his hat, in the vain hope that those watching would think he was brave, and prayed he wouldn't piss his pants. The fierce sun was boring a hole in the top of his head. Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. Shots rang out. The bull staggered toward Jude, then collapsed in a stinking, bloodied mess at his feet. Its sad brown eyes were staring straight at him. Jude shuddered. Perhaps it was a bad omen. The abattoir workers gathered around, trying to work out how they were going to scrape a 2,000-pound bull off the hotel steps. Eve's cheeks were streaked with black mascara. Her favourite hat had been trampled by the bull. When Jude touched her shoulder, she rounded on him. "You conceited bastard! More concerned with your wretched hat than me. Cattle in the main street, for God's sake, and mistreated animals getting slaughtered." Jude smoothed his hair. "Stop shouting, darling. Everyone's staring at us. Don't you darling me. You've got a career and I'm going to be stuck at home. No family, no friends in this God-forsaken country. And you've made me pregnant. How could you do this to me?" Jude shrugged. He had no words. Different women, same complaint. What must the abattoir workers think of him? Hours later, Eve woke in their hotel room. Claustrophobia, heat, grime. The sheets smelt stale and someone had stuck chewing gum under the rim of the bedside lamp. Jude was long gone, trying to sort out things at their new house, or that's what he'd said. What Eve didn't know was that he was relaxing in bed on the other side of town. Jude was ensconced in a Turak mansion, smoking post-coital cigarettes with Monica Larkin, the wife of an architect he'd met on the ship. He'd never had a redhead before. Well, not a real redhead, that is. His last redhead had been a waitress, a foul-mouthed slapper. She'd smelt of fried bacon and her dyed hair had glowed in the dark, whereas Monica reeked of Chanel No. 5 and resembled the girl on the redhead matches box. She'd been greedy, gobbled him right up. Jude's sense of worth was restored. Astonishing how fellatio banished all self-doubt. Monica was wanton, yet delightfully solicitous. "Like something to eat, lover?" "Oh, could you rustle up a cheese omelette?" "Yeah, and some bread and butter soldiers." "Oh, no problem. Love your Pommy accent. It's real classy." God, he missed his mother. Jude was so used to her being there for him, backing him up, bucking him up when the world turned against him. He'd give anything to see her. Although Monica's plump white ass was an acceptable consolation prize. Married women. Why hadn't he thought of it before? Sex in the afternoon, comfortable double bed, and nursery food. A man couldn't ask for more, really. Not true. He could, and he would, just as soon as she'd fed him and mixed him his special dry martini with 2 green olives. Jude lay spread-eagled and let the ceiling fan cool his naked body. He was terrifically proud of his abdominals. Old man Larkin looked at least 5 months pregnant, pathetic runt. The master bedroom was decked out with frilled pink satin, fluffy white rugs, and the most vulgar crystal chandelier he'd ever laid eyes on. Hard to believe the man of the house was a design expert with a job lot of international awards. The Larkins were nouveau riche, but who cared? The only irritant was a yappy poodle with beady eyes. The dog had taken an instant dislike to him and had been on the bed, glaring at Jude the whole time. It had almost put him off his stroke. Eve got out of bed and stared hard at Jude's hat. The Panama stared back, giving nothing away. It was the prince of straw hats, and Jude flattered himself that he looked as suave as Victor Laszlo in Casablanca. The Panama represented everything that Eve didn't like about her new husband. She'd glimpsed his true colours at the exact moment they'd crossed the equator. During some stupid fancy dress party, she'd escaped a drunken Kim Neptune and had stumbled on Jude behind the lifeboats, lifting up a mermaid's tail and fondling her perky breasts. He'd said, "Sorry, darling, I was curious." What the hell did he think the girl had stashed under her tail? A dry martini with 2 olives, perhaps? Eve giggled, then sobered. If only she hadn't ignored her mother's advice, and now it was too late. She'd made her bed and must lie in it. So Eve opened a bottle of duty-free whiskey and poured a triple. And so began Mrs. Jude Worthington's new life in Australia. Eve's new home failed her every expectation. The house was situated on a main road in the suburb inappropriately named Sunshine. She lay alone most nights as 22-wheeled rigs thundered past. There were ants crawling through the cracks, termites in the floorboards, and the barren front lawn was weed-infested. Big crevices appeared almost overnight in the front yard. Every house was identical to its neighbour and was a vile mustard shade. The suburb was industrial rather than residential, the shops utility rather than recreational. Nowhere to go unless she walked to a tiny playground and studied the dog turds. There was a single swing with a bit of shredded bark underfoot, and a sad slide with a dent in the middle, and a prickly bush that served to conceal the local paedophile as he lay in wait for little girls returning from school. Everything was brown and broken. England, my England. Eve struggled to get out of bed in the mornings and kept bursting into tears for no discernible reason. The only renovation had been Jude's installation of a built-in wardrobe for his exclusive use. He wasn't generous with money anymore. "I give you housekeeping every week. You'll just have to make do." So she did. She bought cheap powdered paint, mixed it with water and painted the walls. If there was a gaping hole in the wall, she'd fill it up with coal, wallpaper it up and paint right over the top. As her pregnancy progressed, she found it impossible to bend over, and in the last trimester she just lay on the sofa in her knickers and bra and wept. England, my England. After the birth of her first child, Jude bought her a second-hand sewing machine and she made curtains. The machine wasn't even a treadle. She had to turn the handle with one hand and steer the fabric with the other. The baby was a crier, and the only time Eve could relax was when she'd had a drink, or 3. After a trunk call from her mother, Eve got all assertive. "Jude, I just can't make ends meet on the pittance you give me." He lowered his newspaper and put down his sherry. "Too bad, learn to economise." "But you're on a marvellous salary. All the other British engineers have bought homes in residential suburbs. The Churchills are moving to Camberwell." "Camberwell? How dreary." Eve tried to keep her voice even. "You spend all our money on clothes. That Italian cashmere coat cost a fortune, and those imported French silk shirts. Yet I'm still wearing clothes purchased for the honeymoon." Jude retreated behind his newspaper. "It's not our money, it's my money." After all, he had to contend with Monica's expectations. Wining, dining and gifting her was not something he could stint on. She had one hell of an appetite and only ever ate 5-star. Recently, he nervously suggested Monica might like to try a local Indian restaurant, and she'd rounded on him. "Jude, never again suggest that I should eat third world food." She'd even made him exchange an expensive gift because the diamonds weren't first rate. That woman could pick an inferior diamond at 20 paces. He smiled. Monica was one classy broad. Jude had forgotten all about his wife until he felt sherry hitting him in the face and crash as she tossed his glass into the fireplace. "You are an egocentric prick. I don't know why I married you. Mother was right. I want a divorce. I want to go home." Jude stood up. Sticky sweet sherry was trickling under his collar. "I'll never divorce you. You belong to me till death do us part. You'd have to fight me in the courts. Difficult without funds, darling." He slapped her hard across the chops. The results were instant. She sat down, speechless, with an angry red welt across her jaw and a split lip, and something deep inside her broke. Jude took a shower, smothered himself in Old Spice, and went out. He stayed out till 5 in the morning, and Eve said nothing. Success! At last he'd found the solution to his domestic problems. The next time Jude stayed out all night, Eve took his Panama hat and stuffed it full of ripe peaches from the tree. She then hid it in the garage. By the time Jude found the hat, it was rotten and stinking to high heaven. He had to make a stand, and so Eve wore sunglasses in public to cover up another black eye. Mrs. Brown cornered Eve at the milk bar. "Mrs. Worthington, is yous all right? Saw you pegging out the clothes. Looks like you got a nasty black eye there." Eve laughed. "Oh, yes, I slipped on the soap getting into a bubble bath." "Half your luck." Eve's luck continued. Eve knew Jude was seeing other women, as there were all the telltale signs. Match folders from nightclubs and fancy restaurants with phone numbers scrawled on them, anonymous phone calls where the person hung up on hearing her voice, smudges of makeup on his shirts, cheap lacy knickers stashed in the glove box of the Citroen. When Eve had flung the knickers at Jude, he'd slapped her around some more. He was getting better at it. Now when he hit her, he did it in such a way that his neighbours couldn't spot the damage. Not that they were suspicious. Hell, everybody knew that wife-beaters were only to be found amongst the lower classes. The locals didn't know what to make of Eve and her plummy accent. Even when she wore a simple sundress and straw hat, she looked like she'd stepped from a fashion magazine. She walked everywhere because Jude refused to teach her how to drive. The greengrocer kindly undertook to deliver her vegetables every week and would be waiting on her doorstep when she returned from his shop. But the local wives bad-mouthed Eve until Edith Jones took a stand. "I'm giving her an invite, telling her to bring a plate. She may not be as stuck-up as she looks. Your lot can come or not. I don't give a stuff." Eve was delighted to receive Edith's invitation, but somewhat perplexed. Who would have thought these chain-smoking women appreciated the finer things in life? Just because Mrs. Jones sat on her front porch picking fleas from her dog didn't mean she wasn't interested in fine china. No matter, Eve would take her best Royal Dalton serving dish. It dated back to Queen Victoria's era. They'd have lots to talk about. When Eve placed her empty plate down on Edith's coffee table, there was a deathly silence. All the other visiting plastic plates were in the kitchen, laden with lamingtons, sponge cakes, jam fancies, and chocolate crackles. It was a lesson Eve never forgot. But getting a handle on Australian culture was a humiliating process. When the coal man dumped his load on the back porch and yelled out, "See you later, love," Eve waited in all afternoon and was offended when he didn't return. Jude was finding work increasingly distasteful. He'd been overlooked for promotion, and his male colleagues were distant. Instead of climbing the hierarchy, he was in a holding pattern, and the only place he genuinely felt welcome was the typing pool, and he'd had most of the secretaries already. Depression had him and would not let go. His affair with Monica was going to the dogs. It was increasingly difficult to get an erection, and soon she traded him in for a more virile chap, fresh from the ship. Meantime, Eve was surreptitiously doing chemistry experiments in her kitchen. She began collecting moths and messing with fungus, spores, and rotting fish. She analysed household poisons and managed to decimate the ant army and put the termites out of business. As her powers grew, so did her authority in the neighbourhood, and she provided chemical solutions for everything, including head lice, bedbugs, silverfish and pantry moths. Mr. Jones, the local pharmacist, eagerly anticipated her visits. "Ah, Mrs. Worthington, good to see you again. Please, call me Eve." "Well, in that case, call me Jeremy." He blushed. Eve smiled. She'd once owned a plump hamster called Jeremy, and the two had much in common. Eve and Jeremy began having long, nourishing chats about chemical matters. Eve Worthington was like something from the movies, and so Jeremy was willing to bend the rules when supplying her with regulated poisons for her kitchen business. Nice she could earn pin money for herself. Maybe she'd treat herself to some of those new cosmetics he'd ordered in. Not that she needed them. She was perfect already. He knew because he'd seen her buck naked in his sexual fantasies. Before long, Eve was making more than pin money. She started selling potions for skin problems. Her biggest success was curing Mrs. Stark's eczema. The remedy had eluded the Collins Street skin specialists and haunted Mrs. Stark for years. "That Mrs. Worthington knows her onions. Fixed me up proper, she did." Such was Mrs. Stark's gratitude that local wives consulted Eve on their hemorrhoids, scaly skin, and assorted unmentionables. Eve squirreled away the money she earned in a jam jar. Soon the jar was full, and she took to stashing money in a flour sack in the pantry. Eventually she grew bolder and opened a bank account in her maiden name. None of this was mentioned to the master of the house. Around this time, Eve began an affair with a member of Jude's hunting club. The men went wild pig shooting in New South Wales, and it was lovely having her husband away at weekends. Eve hadn't meant to turn into an adulteress every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon from 12 till 2, but Dr. Gerald Ashton had been so kind and attentive. His bedside manner was impeccable. He was handsome, a man of few words, and younger than she. But more importantly, he was a man of integrity. He liked doing things around the house for her, and he made her feel like a woman. Jerry was up front. "Most blokes can't stand your husband. When they got rat-faced on our last hunting trip, I had to talk them out of murdering him. Accidents often happen on these shoots. Guns go off when blokes are cleaning them, or someone mistakes their best mate for a wallaby." Eve imagined herself as a grieving widow. It was a remarkably pleasant sensation. When Jude came home at 5 a.m. on Christmas Day, Eve went through his pockets and found a woman's telephone number and his dental plate. It had been carefully wrapped in his monogrammed handkerchief. Eve whisked the dental plate out to the garage and hit it hard, once, with a hammer. She then stuffed the pieces back into the handkerchief and put it back where she'd found it. A remarkable thing happened. Because he'd blacked out, Jude had no recollection of how his false tooth had disintegrated. He said nothing to Eve and quietly paid an emergency visit to the local dentist. Eve cried when she found pornographic photos of a pubescent girl hidden in Jude's filing cabinet. It scared her to think that her daughter was growing into a pretty nymphette. Who knew what Jude was capable of? Eve said nothing and put the photos back. She then wedged 6 king prawns behind the painting in his study and repapered the back of the frame. Jude went crazy for weeks. "What do you mean you can't smell it? The bloody place reeks of it." Eve shrugged. "I don't know what you're talking about, darling." She removed all traces of the rotten prawns after he'd made an appointment to get the fumigators in. Naturally, when the servicemen arrived, they found nothing, and Jude was left questioning his sanity. He'd been on shaky ground since Monica had dumped him. Despite all Jude's womanizing, he still had time for his wife in bed, and if she resisted him, things got nasty. Soon she was pregnant again, and the idea of leaving him had to be shelved. When Mrs. Stark's dog ate rat poison and died, Eve became thoughtful. She visited the public library and read up on the attributes of antimony potassium nitrate. It was not quite a true metal, but was as toxic as arsenic. It had a mild taste that could easily be masked by food and beverages. Large doses would trigger stomach muscle reflexes and make the victim vomit and purge. But in small doses, taken over a period of time, it accumulated in the human body. It had been the poison of choice for several famous British killers, namely because antimony poisoning mimicked food poisoning, peritonitis, delirium tremens, TB, consumption, stomach cancer, and gastritis. Eve closed the book and put it back on the shelf with trembling hands. Another year rolled by, and Jude no longer woke up feeling peachy. He felt below par, and his erection problems increased. Eve was very concerned about his health. She made trips into the city and bought him special nerve tonics that came all the way from Germany. At the end of a grueling day, she'd cook his favourite meals and listen to him whinge about his colleagues. Jude informed his hunting mates, "Women need a firm hand. Take my wife, for instance. She likes to know who's boss." Jude's moods were increasingly sour. His daughters would stop playing when they heard his car on the driveway. Eve would try to predict his mood from the way he slammed the car door. Jude didn't have to be drunk to get violent. The next-door neighbours took to turning up the radio when they heard Jude yelling. Mr. Stark ticked off Mrs. Stark. "Stay out of it, love. It's none of our damn business what goes on next door." If the kids made noise when Jude was on the phone, he'd hang up, seize them by their hair, and crack their heads together. The Starks sometimes heard Eve yelling, "Stop it! Leave them alone, you bastard!" Then there would be sudden silence, and Eve wouldn't be seen for a couple of days. If he'd had a particularly bad day at work, Jude would wait until they were all seated at the dinner table, and then flip the table over, leaving them crying, covered in food and broken crockery. Eve waited and daydreamed. As autumn turned into winter, Jude was stunned to discover his magnificent Italian coat was moth-eaten, as were his piles of cashmere jumpers and silk shirts. Everything had to be destroyed. He crouched naked on the floor and examined his winter brogues. "Eve! Come quickly, something horrendous has happened." There was no response, as Eve had gone over to Mrs. Stark's for a cup of tea. Jude's brogues were covered in green mould, and strange spores had colonised and ruined his winter boots. Jude lay face down on the bed and wept. Later, Mr. Stark spied Jude, stark naked, dragging his ruined clothing out to the incinerator and burning the lot of it. At the pub that night, the story did the rounds. "Oh, he's a bit of a wanker, that Worthington bloke." "Yeah, mate, but all the Sheilas reckon he's a movie star." Laughter all round. Jude decided he needed to get away with the chaps for a weekend, make peace with Mother Nature, try to get over the death of his wardrobe. Jerry went to pick Jude up in his ute. He stowed Jude's gear into the ute as Jude combed his hair and checked himself out in the rear vision mirror. "Oh, for God's sake, Jude, leave your bloody hair alone." As Eve waved them off, Jerry glimpsed a black eye behind her sunglasses and bruise marks on her throat. He found it hard to speak a civil word to Jude for the entire trip. Jerry decided not to tell Jude about the finalisation of his divorce. Jude had a terrible time. His gut was playing up and his nerves were frayed. He gulped down the German nerve tonic, but instead of making him feel better, it made him worse. In the end, he chucked it in the river. Then Jude shot himself in the kneecap, or at least that's what he thought had happened. Sheer agony. No wonder they were so keen on kneecapping in Belfast. He'd been drunkenly reloading his muzzle loader at the time, and there'd been pandemonium all round. Yelling, shouted orders and drunken men stumbling across hot coals. "There's a pack of black pigs up behind the tents. Load up, load up!" Guns were going off everywhere, war at its most diabolical. Some of the blokes were so drunk they were shooting their own shadows. The only sober presence was Jerry. Mate, I think I'm going to have to drive you to the hospital." Jerry rang Eve from a country hospital near the border. I've recommended they keep him in for a bit. It'll give you more time. He won't be lonely. Half the lads are having their stomachs pumped after eating diseased wild pig, undercooked with a red wine marinade. Trust me, honey, you don't want to know the details. But just make sure you've got everything sorted for when Bruce arrives. On Jude's return, he found his house empty. All the kids' toys were gone. Eve's wardrobe had been cleaned out. The guinea pigs weren't in their cage and the cat was missing. Good riddance to the cat, he hated it. Recently it had taken to pissing in Jude's slippers and spraying his gun collection. Shame about the dog, though. He had real potential as a hunting hound. Jude dragged his gammy leg up onto the sofa and closed his eyes. His gut was giving him hell. Never in all his life had he been so ill. If only he still had Eve to take care of him. If only his chum Jerry would answer the damn phone. Jude wasn't going to waste his money taxiing to hospital or booking a doctor's home visit. Instead, he drank more whiskey, swallowed a bottle of prescription painkillers and passed out. His corpse was found 3 days later by Mrs. Stark. The autopsy reported that he died of accidental overdose, possibly complicated by acute food poisoning, gastritis, and a skin full of alcohol. Jerry gave up pig hunting. It was a filthy business. Besides, he preferred spending weekends with his new family. Eve, her 2 girls, 5 guinea pigs, 3 goldfish, a beagle puppy, and an affectionate tomcat called Ant, short for Antimony. Unusual name for a cat, but Jerry could live with it. The end. Thanks so much for listening. We'd love to get your feedback and we'd love to reach more listeners. Our website is sistersincrime.org.au and our email address is admin@sistersincrime.org.au. Until next Friday then, when we bring you another scintillating story from Australian women crime creative.